The diary wasn't supposed to be there. I was on my knees by the bed, sorting through a mess of yoga gear when I saw it. Wedged between her neatly rolled mat and a pair of blocks was a small, leather-bound book. My first thought was harmless. Oh, a gratitude journal. Classic yoga stuff. But then I hesitated. Why was it hidden? I glanced at the clock. She wouldn't be back for another 2 hours. Plenty of time. With a knot forming in my stomach, I picked it up. The leather felt warm in my hands, soft and worn, like it had been opened and closed hundreds of times. The front page was unassuming, just her neat handwriting. This is where I can be honest. My gut tightened. Something about that line felt off. Still, I wasn't prepared for what I found when I flipped to the first entry. March 2nd. Marcus stayed late after yoga class today to help me with my form. God, his hands were so strong. When he slid them down my hips, I swear I forgot I was married for a second. I froze, my eyes darting over the words, trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding. Surely, she wasn't writing about, but the next sentence left no room for doubt. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. My hand trembled as I turned the page, each line worse than the last. Marcus wasn't alone in this sick little story. There was Dylan, who gave her butterflies, and Aaron, who had the kind of body that made me want to sin. The names piled up. The details were explicit, raw, and so detached it felt like she was writing fiction. Except this wasn't fiction. This was my life. By the 5th page, I couldn't read anymore. My chest burned like I'd swallowed fire, my mind racing between rage and disbelief. I dropped the diary onto the bed as if it might bite me. But then I picked it up again. I needed to know how far this went, how long I'd been living in this lie. Page after page, the truth spilled out, each word erasing the woman I thought I knew. Months of yoga classes that weren't yoga at all. Weekend retreats that turned into rendezvous. A network of lovers who had no idea I existed, or worse, didn't care. By the time I reached the last entry, my vision blurred with anger. The most recent date was 2 days ago, November 10th. Tonight's class was intense, but worth it. Brandon said I've never looked more flexible. He said I should come over after class, so he could show me some moves of his own. I can't wait to see him. The diary snapped shut in my hands, the sound breaking the eerie silence of the room. My teeth clenched so hard I thought they might crack. I sat there, staring at the closed cover, trying to process what I had just read. It wasn't just one betrayal. It was dozens, all laid out in her tidy little handwriting, each word a dagger to the life I thought we shared. The front door slammed. She was home early. I looked at the diary, then at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The decision was immediate. I was going to confront her. Not later. Not gently. Right now. I didn't know exactly what I'd say, but I knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to weasel her way out of this. Not this time. She walked into the house with the breezy confidence of someone who thought their secrets were safe. I heard her setting her bag down in the hallway, her voice light as she called out, "Hey, babe, I got us that new chai blend you like." Chai. She still had time to think about tea while her double life sprawled across the pages of her diary upstairs. I didn't answer. My chest felt tight, like I was holding in a scream, but I forced myself to stay seated on the edge of the bed, staring at the diary clenched in my hands. Her footsteps grew closer, then stopped when she appeared in the doorway. Her smile faltered the moment she saw me. She looked at the diary in my hands, her face shifting from confusion to something sharper. "What's that?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. My eyes locked onto hers, and I saw it fear. A flicker of guilt behind her usually serene gaze. She knew. "Why don't you tell me?" I said, my voice low but trembling with barely contained anger. I opened the diary to a random page and began to read aloud. Marcus's hands on me made me feel alive in ways I didn't know I could. My voice cracked as I continued. "I know it's wrong, but it feels so right." Her lips parted, words stumbling over themselves as she tried to respond. "Wait, no, it's not." I cut her off by flipping to another page, my voice louder now. "Dylan kissed me in the parking lot today. I didn't stop him. God, I didn't want to." "Stop." Erin's body makes me want to stop. Her shout echoed through the room, but I refused to let her off the hook. I slammed the diary shut and stood, the blood pounding in my ears as I towered over her. You wrote this. You chose this. My voice was raw, filled with months of unspoken doubt and pain I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. I gave you everything, my trust, my heart, and you gave yourself to them. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the bed. Tears streaked her face as she shook her head. It wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. You weren't trying to hurt me? You just accidentally wrote a how-to guide on betrayal. She reached for my hand, but I yanked it away like her touch burned. Please, you have to understand. I was lost. I didn't know how to save it, I snapped. Don't you dare stand there and tell me this was about being lost or confused. You knew exactly what you were doing every single time. For a moment, the room was suffocatingly quiet. She clutched her hands to her chest, her breath hiccuping between sobs. And me? I stood there, watching her crumble, but I felt no satisfaction. Just emptiness. How does someone you've loved for years, a person you thought you knew better than anyone, become a stranger? How do you reconcile the face you adore with the darkness they've hidden behind it? Temptation. That's the word she clung to when she finally spoke again. It wasn't about you. It was temptation, a way to feel alive again. I never stopped loving you. My fist clenched. The word felt hollow, a cheap excuse for crossing lines we both knew shouldn't be crossed. Love, I hissed. You call this love? She sobbed harder, but I couldn't tell if it was from shame, regret, or just the fear of losing the life she'd been balancing so precariously. Temptation may be human, but betrayal? That's a choice. And tonight, I'd finally realized it wasn't just her actions that shattered me. It was the utter lack of respect for everything we'd built. There was no coming back from this. The person I had loved was gone, replaced by someone who cared more about fleeting thrills than the man who would have done anything for her. And the worst part? She didn't even deny it. In the quiet that followed, I found myself looking at her like she was some sort of phantom. Not my wife, the woman I had spent years building a life with, but a shadow of her, an unfamiliar figure wearing her face. The room felt like a stage, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of the props. The bed we had shared, the photos on the wall, the clothes we had folded together just days ago. All these relics of a life I thought was real. How could something so familiar feel so alien? Her sobs filled the space, but they didn't reach me. I was locked in my head, replaying moments I had once cherished, now warped under the weight of her betrayal. There was the time she insisted on taking up yoga in the first place, her smile bright as she said, "It'll help me center myself." I had supported her, even joked about joining her. She laughed and said, "It's my thing, silly. You don't even like stretching." And then there were the nights she came home late, flushed and glowing, blaming extra reps or deep meditation sessions. I had believed her. Of course I had. Because when you love someone, you trust them. You don't second-guess every smile or every alibi. That trust was the part that stung the most. It was more than love. It was faith, a deep-seated belief that no matter what happened in the world, she was my person. The one who would always have my back, just as I had hers. Now, that faith lay in ruins, crushed under the weight of her diary and the life she had been leading behind my back. "Please," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "Say something." "What's left to say?" I muttered, the words thick in my throat. She looked at me with wide, desperate eyes. "I never stopped loving you. You have to believe me." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "You think this is about love? Love doesn't make you betray someone over and over again. Love doesn't leave a trail of lies for your husband to stumble over while cleaning the bedroom." Her face crumpled, but I pressed on. "I had to. You wrote it all down," I said, the venom creeping back into my voice. "Every single thing. Why? Was it some sick trophy? A way to relive it all when you were bored?" "No," she said, shaking her head wildly. "It wasn't like that. Writing it down, it was a release, a way to deal with the guilt. The guilt? I snapped, stepping closer. You didn't feel guilty enough to stop. Don't stand there and insult me by pretending you wrote those pages out of shame. She flinched, and for a second, I felt the smallest flicker of pity. But I extinguished it as quickly as it came. I turned away, running my hand through my hair, trying to find some shred of clarity in the storm raging inside me. How do we get here? How does a marriage that began with promises of forever fall apart so completely? Why? I finally asked, my voice softer now. Was I not enough for you? No, she said quickly, too quickly. It wasn't about you. It was me. I was broken, I guess. I was looking for something I didn't even understand. That's convenient, I said bitterly. You didn't understand it, but you understood how to lie to me. You understood how to cover your tracks. Her silence was deafening. The truth settled over me like a lead blanket. This wasn't something I could fix. There was no patching up the gaping hole she had torn in us. I couldn't trust her again, not after this. Trust isn't a light switch. Once it's broken, it doesn't just turn back on. The weight of that realization was staggering. I had spent so many years pouring myself into this relationship, trusting it would stand the test of time. And now, it was nothing but ash. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. Not anymore. Her sobs started anew, but I didn't turn to face her. I just stared at the diary on the bed, the leather cover mocking me with its neat little title. Balance is key. Maybe for her. But for me, this was the end. I sat alone in the kitchen, the weight of the silence pressing against my chest like a boulder. She was upstairs now crying. The sound was faint but constant, drifting down the stairs like the remnants of a storm I couldn't escape. I had left her there after I said the words I never thought I'd say. I'm done. The kitchen table was bare except for the wine glass I hadn't touched and the diary that now felt radioactive. I didn't want to look at it, but it was there, daring me to open it again, as if I hadn't already burned enough of myself reading her confessions. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't hit you all at once. At first, it's like a knife sliding between your ribs, sharp and immediate. But as the hours pass, you realize the blade is still there, twisting deeper, cutting into places you didn't even know could hurt. I wanted to believe her words upstairs, the broken apologies she had spilled like water from a cracked glass. I wanted to believe she was lost, that this was some temporary madness that didn't define her. But the truth was undeniable. She had made choices. Over and over, she had chosen others, chosen herself. And every time she'd walk through the door, smiling at me like nothing was wrong, she had chosen to lie. The questions came in waves, each one more haunting than the last. Was I blind? Stupid? Too trusting? I thought back to the early days of our relationship, when trust wasn't something we talked about because it was just there like air. We never doubted each other. Back then, her laugh lit up a room, and her touch felt like home. When did that change? Was it when she started yoga? When she began pulling away? Or had the cracks been there all along, hidden under the surface, waiting for the right moment to split wide open? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. There was no point in asking why anymore. The why wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't erase the images in my head, the men's names in her diary, the smirk I imagined on Marcus's face every time he touched her. But the worst part wasn't her actions. It was what she'd stolen from me. She had taken my ability to believe in her, in us. She had turned love into a question mark, trust into a crutch that I didn't know how to stand without. Even if she begged me for forgiveness, even if I somehow found it in myself to stay, I would never look at her the same way again. And that was the cruelest cut of all. The floor creaked upstairs. Her crying had stopped, replaced by muffled footsteps pacing back and forth. She was waiting for me to come back up, to say something, to give her a glimmer of hope. But I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to, I did. There was still a part of me, buried deep under the anger, that wanted to hold her, to make this better somehow. But how do you rebuild something that's been ground to dust? I thought about trust, about how fragile it is. You spend years building it brick by brick, carefully constructing something solid. But it only takes one moment, one choice, to knock the whole thing down. And she hadn't just knocked it down. She had lit the match, set it ablaze, and walked away without looking back. I picked up the diary, flipping it open one last time. The words blurred in front of me, but one line caught my eye. Sometimes I wonder if he suspects anything. If he does, he never says it. He trusts me completely. The words punched the air out of my lungs. I slammed the book shut and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, falling to the floor, open-faced like a corpse. There was no fixing this. I stood, grabbed my coat, and walked out the door without looking back. The cool night air hit me, and for the first time all night, I could breathe. Somewhere in that house, she was still waiting for me to come back. But she wouldn't find me there. Not anymore. The night air hit me like a slap, cool and sharp against my flushed skin. My steps were aimless as I left the house, the sound of gravel crunching under my shoes the only noise in the stillness. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere felt better than staying. I stuffed my hands in my pockets, my fingers curling into fists. The betrayal replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Her words, her tears, her excuses. Every step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into a chasm I didn't know how to climb out of. For years, I had been her safe place, her constant. She used to say I was her rock, the person she could count on no matter what. I'd believed her because I wanted to, because I wanted to be enough for her. But now I realized I had built my life around someone who never gave me the same in return. The diary had exposed everything, but it wasn't just the affairs that shattered me. It was what they meant, that she had taken my trust, the one thing I gave her without reservation, and turned it into a game. A private indulgence she could write about while I stayed at home, believing we were solid. I stopped at the edge of the park, staring at the empty playground bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. It was a place we used to walk to on weekends, holding hands, laughing about nothing in particular. She'd always pull me onto the swings, daring me to see who could go higher. Now, I couldn't even look at it without feeling sick. I sat on a nearby bench, letting my head fall into my hands. My mind churned with questions that had no answers. How could she do this? Why didn't she stop? Was it ever real for her? The worst part was knowing I'd never get the truth. Even if she confessed everything, there'd always be doubt. Was she being honest now? Or was this another layer of manipulation? Betrayal doesn't just break trust, it poisons it. I thought about temptation, the word she'd clung to earlier like a shield. She'd painted herself as a victim of her own desires, as if cheating wasn't a choice, but an unstoppable force. But temptation isn't a monster that drags you into its lair. It's a door you decide to walk through. And she hadn't just walked through it once. She'd practically propped it open. A sharp laugh escaped my throat, startling me. It was bitter and hollow, the sound of a man who had nothing left to lose. I leaned back on the bench, staring up at the stars. They were bright tonight, scattered across the sky like diamonds. Funny how they could shine so beautifully, oblivious to the chaos below. I thought about going back to the house. Maybe there was more to say. Maybe I owed her one last conversation. But the thought of sitting across from her, hearing her voice, seeing her tears, it felt like an open wound I couldn't bear to touch. She was upstairs, probably waiting for me, hoping I'd walk through the door and tell her we could fix this, that I'd stay. But I wouldn't. The truth settled over me, heavy and undeniable. Our marriage wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a broken contract. She had made her choices, and now I had to make mine. I stood from the bench, my hands trembling as I pulled my phone from my pocket. I scrolled through my contacts until I found my lawyer's number. My thumb hovered over it for a moment before I pressed dial. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Hello." "Hi," I said, my voice steady for the first time all night. "It's me. I need to talk about filing for divorce." The words hung in the air, weighty but liberating. As I hung up and started walking again, I felt something shift. The pain was still there, raw and searing. But beneath it was a flicker of something else, clarity. This wasn't just the end of us, it was the beginning of me. The house loomed in front of me as I returned from the park, its windows glowing warmly against the dark night. It was deceptive, really. How something so familiar could feel so foreign now. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a crime scene, a mausoleum for the marriage I'd once believed in. My hand rested on the doorknob, hesitating. Part of me wanted to turn around, to disappear into the night, and leave her wondering if I'd ever come back. But no, I needed to go inside, to finish what this night had started. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped into the entryway. The air inside felt heavier, like the house itself had absorbed the tension from earlier. Upstairs, I could hear the faint shuffle of her footsteps. She was pacing again, probably rehearsing some kind of plea, another string of excuses she thought might save this. I hung my coat on the hook, the motions automatic. My body felt disconnected from my mind, like I was watching someone else move. The rage from earlier had burned out, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. It wasn't the kind of tired sleep could fix. It was a deep, soul-crushing fatigue that came from carrying too much pain for too long. Her footsteps stopped as I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood sending a shiver of anticipation through me. When I reached the bedroom, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked up as I entered, her lips parting as if to speak, but I held up a hand to silence her. "Don't," I said, my voice low but firm. "I don't want to hear it right now." She blinked, her expression crumbling further. "Please, just let me explain." "You've explained enough," I said, cutting her off. My gaze drifted to the diary, still lying where I had thrown it against the wall. Its pages were splayed open, mocking me with the secrets it still held. She followed my gaze, then buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered, her voice muffled. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Every time you met one of them, every time you wrote about it, you made a choice. And you didn't stop. Not once." Her sobs grew louder, but they didn't move me. They couldn't. I'd spent so long ignoring the small doubts, the tiny red flags, convincing myself that love was enough to weather anything. But now, faced with the truth, I realized how naive I'd been. "I loved you," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to keep it steady. "I trusted you with everything I had. And you—" I trailed off, shaking my head. "You threw it all away. For what? A thrill? A distraction?" She looked up, her face streaked with tears, desperation etched into every line. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I wish I could tell you, but I don't even know why I did it. I hate myself for it. I hate what I've done to you." Her words should have meant something. They should have made me feel something. But they didn't. They were too late, too hollow to undo the damage. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the divorce papers. Her eyes widened as I placed them on the nightstand. "I'm done," I said simply. "This isn't salvageable. You made sure of that." She stared at the papers as if they might bite her. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. I can fix it. We can fix it." I shook my head, stepping back toward the door. "There's no we anymore," I said quietly. "You ended at the moment you decided I wasn't enough." Her sobs followed me as I walked out of the room, but I didn't look back. As I closed the front door behind me and stepped into the cool night, I realized something. Trust isn't just the foundation of a relationship. It's the glue that holds it together. And once it's shattered, no amount of apologies can put the pieces back together. This wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. My beginning. I didn't go far that night. I parked the car in an empty lot and sat in the dark, my fingers gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The hum of the engine filled the silence, but it couldn't drown out the echoes of her voice, her excuses, her sobs. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes after betrayal, a hollowing out of everything you thought you were. It's not just about the loss of love. It's the realization that the person you trusted most was capable of lying to your face. Again and again, I thought about the way she used to look at me, her eyes bright with love and promises of forever. When had that changed? Had it been gradual, slipping through my fingers without me noticing? Or had it been sudden, like a door slamming shut? The questions were relentless. Was I enough? Did she ever love me the way I loved her? When she smiled at me, was it real? Or was she thinking about someone else? Every thought spiraled into the next, pulling me deeper into a pit of doubt and anger. I wanted answers, but I knew they wouldn't fix anything. They wouldn't take away the sting of her betrayal or erase the images burned into my mind. Somewhere in my haze, I glanced at the clock. Midnight. I hadn't eaten since that disastrous dinner, but the thought of food made my stomach churn. Instead, I leaned back in my seat, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. For years, I had built my life around her. Every decision, every plan, every dream, I had shaped them with her in mind. Now, all of it felt meaningless. The future I'd envisioned with her had crumbled into dust, leaving me with nothing but the raw edges of my anger and heartbreak. I thought about the word temptation, the excuse she had clung to earlier. It echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. Temptation wasn't some uncontrollable force. It was a choice, one she had made over and over again. But what was worse was how deliberate it all felt. She hadn't just betrayed me in the moment. She had documented it, as if reliving the betrayal on paper gave her some twisted sense of power. Or maybe it was guilt. I'd never know, and maybe I didn't want to. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it all press down on me. How do you move forward after something like this? How do you trust again, love again, when the person who was supposed to protect your heart was the one who broke it? The thought of starting over terrified me. I wasn't naive enough to believe I'd bounce back easily. This wasn't a wound that time could heal. It was a scar I'd carry for the rest of my life. I opened my eyes and stared at the dashboard, the divorce papers still fresh in my mind. The decision was made. There was no going back. And yet, the pain lingered, not just from her betrayal, but from the realization that this was the end of us. That the person I had loved for years was now a stranger I couldn't bear to face. The car felt stifling, the air thick with emotions I couldn't name. I rolled down the window, letting the cool breeze wash over me. It didn't fix anything, but it made the weight on my chest a little more bearable. In the distance, the faint glow of the city lights flickered like a reminder that life would go on. But for now, I sat there, letting the night wrap around me, holding on to the one truth I still had. I deserved better than this. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, the edges of the sky bleeding into pale streaks of light, I was still parked in the same empty lot. My body ached from sitting too long, and my mind felt like a battlefield, littered with the wreckage of memories I couldn't escape. Sleep wasn't the issue. Peace was. I'd been running through the same loop in my head all night. The moments I should have seen it, the words I wished I'd said, the anger I wished I'd unleashed. But the betrayal didn't get quieter. It didn't soften. It just echoed louder, feeding on every silent hour. I drove home in a daze, the city waking up around me. Joggers darted across sidewalks, people sipped coffee at outdoor tables, and kids waited for school buses. It all felt surreal, like a movie set I didn't belong in anymore. My world had stopped, and yet everyone else's just kept spinning. When I reached the house, I half expected her to be gone. Part of me hoped she would be, that I'd walk inside to find her clothes gone, her scent erased from the air, her presence wiped clean. But the house was quiet, unnervingly so. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. Her shoes were still by the door. Her bag was on the hook. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt the same. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee clutched in her hands. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "You didn't come back last night," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the counter and poured myself a cup of coffee, the act mechanical, devoid of meaning. When I finally turned to face her, she was staring into her mug, her fingers trembling. "I thought you might leave for good," she said, her voice cracking. "I wouldn't have blamed you." I set the mug down, leaning against the counter as I crossed my arms. "You're right. You wouldn't have." Her gaze snapped to mine, and for a moment, I saw something raw and unguarded in her expression. Regret, shame, fear, but none of it mattered. "Not anymore. You've already made your choices," I said evenly. "And now I'm making mine. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't stop. She needed to hear this, and I needed to say it. I don't know what you thought you'd find out there, I continued. But whatever it wasn't worth losing us. I didn't want to lose you, she said quickly, her voice thick with desperation. I was stupid, selfish, broken. You keep saying that. I interrupted, my tone sharper now. But it doesn't change what you did. You didn't trip and fall into their arms. You chose them. Over me. Over us. She broke then, her sobs filling the room as she buried her face in her hands. It was a sound that once would have gutted me, that once would have had me pulling her into my arms, promising her it would all be okay. But now, it was just noise. I picked up my coffee and walked to the door. Her sobs grew louder as I reached for the handle, her voice breaking as she called out, "Please, don't go. Don't leave me like this." I turned, looking at her one last time. "You left me a long time ago," I said quietly. Her cries followed me as I walked out the door and into the cold morning air. This time I wasn't coming back. I drove without a destination, the morning sun casting long shadows across the road. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, lighting up with her name over and over again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every time it rang, I felt the weight of what I'd left behind pressing against me. Memories of the life we'd built, the plans we'd made, the love we'd shared before it all unraveled. But with every mile I put between us, the weight started to shift. It wasn't just loss I was feeling. It was freedom. I pulled into a parking lot by the lake, the same spot we used to come to for picnics on lazy weekends. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stepped out of the car and walked to the water's edge. The surface was calm, a mirror reflecting the pale sky, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt still. The last 24 hours had been a storm, and I had let it sweep me away. The rage, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had all consumed me. But now, standing there with the sun warming my face and the wind brushing through the trees, I realized something. I wasn't just grieving her actions. I was grieving the version of myself who had trusted so completely, who had loved without hesitation. That man was gone. I sat on a bench near the water, the cool wood grounding me as I stared at the horizon. My mind drifted to the diary again, the one I'd left on the bed like a confession she couldn't take back. I hated it, hated every word she'd written, but I hated myself a little too, for missing the signs, for convincing myself things were fine when deep down, I knew they weren't. How many times had I chosen to ignore my gut? How many times had I dismissed her distance as stress, her excuses as harmless? The truth was I had trusted her because I wanted to believe in us, because I was too scared to confront the cracks I'd started to notice months ago. I had held on to the idea of our marriage like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood, refusing to admit that it was already sinking. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. It reminded me of the camping trip we'd taken early in our marriage, back when everything felt simple and bright. She'd smiled at me, then like I was her whole world. I had believed that smile. Now, I wondered if she ever felt the same way I did. If she ever looked at me and thought, this is the person I'll love forever. The phone buzzed again, pulling me out of my thoughts. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. Her texts had probably gone from apologies to please, maybe even anger. But I wasn't ready to face her yet. Not now. Maybe not ever. Instead, I opened a new note on my phone and started typing. Not to her. Not to anyone really. Just to myself. You are not defined by her choices. You are not less because she chose to betray you. You deserve more than someone who takes your love for granted. The words felt awkward at first, but as I typed, they started to feel real. Like a reminder I needed to hear, even if it was just from myself. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the water. I stayed on that bench, letting the warmth seep into my skin, until I finally felt ready to move. I didn't know what the next step was. The road ahead felt uncertain, daunting even. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Because whatever came next, I knew I wouldn't settle for anything less than I deserved. And I deserved better than a woman who had traded trust for temptation. I stood, sliding my phone into my pocket, and walked back to the car. The future was mine to rebuild, one piece at a time. The days after leaving her were a blur of paperwork, silence, and second-guessing. Divorcing someone isn't just untangling your lies on paper. It's peeling back every layer of who you were together and deciding what's left when they're gone. I wasn't just mourning her. I was mourning the man I thought I was when I loved her. Her attempts to contact me became less frequent as the weeks went by. At first, it was constant. Texts, voicemails, long emails spilling out promises to change, desperate apologies wrapped in hollow words. Then the tone shifted. Anger seeped in. She accused me of giving up too quickly, of being heartless for not letting her fix this. But I knew better. She didn't want to fix us. She wanted to fix the version of herself that had been exposed. And I couldn't be part of that anymore. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, really looking at myself for the first time since I'd left. My face looked older, the lines around my eyes deeper, my shoulders hunched under the weight I'd been carrying. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. I thought about all the years I had spent giving everything I had to her, to our marriage. The sacrifices I'd made, the dreams I'd adjusted, the quiet moments where I told myself that love was enough to get us through anything. Love is enough when both people are holding it with care. She hadn't done that, and it wasn't my fault. For so long, I'd been carrying the guilt she should have been shouldering, wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have been better. But the truth was simple. Her betrayal wasn't about me. It was about her. That realization hit me like a lightning bolt, electrifying and painful all at once. I wasn't responsible for her choices. I had given her love, loyalty, and trust, everything I could offer. She had chosen to throw it away, piece by piece, entry by entry in that diary. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of relief. Not joy, not peace, just a small, fragile sense of freedom. I started making changes, small at first. I went to the gym, not to escape, but to remind myself what it felt like to move, to push forward. I reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen in years, apologizing for the time I'd let slip away. One night, I found myself sitting on the couch in my new apartment, a book in my lap and music playing softly in the background. It was nothing extraordinary, but it felt good. And then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I laughed. It was small, barely more than a chuckle, but it was real. I realized in that moment that the man I used to be wasn't gone. He was just buried under layers of pain and betrayal. But he was still there, waiting for me to find him again. The divorce papers were finalized a month later. She didn't fight it. I didn't go to the courthouse in person. I couldn't face her again. But when my lawyer called to say it was done, I felt an enormous weight lift from my chest. I went to the lake that evening, the same spot I'd sat in after leaving her. The water was calm, the sky streaked with orange and pink. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. This was it, the end of one story, the beginning of another. I wasn't whole yet. There were still cracks, places where the hurt seeped in when I wasn't careful. But I was healing. Slowly, surely, I was piecing myself back together. As I sat there, I made a promise to myself to be kind to the man I was becoming, to rebuild my life on a foundation of self-respect, not fear, to never again give my heart to someone who couldn't hold it with care. Because if there was one thing this journey had taught me, it was this: love is precious. But trust? Trust is sacred, and I wouldn't settle for anything less.